Good morning. Glad everyone's here this morning. It's cold and slippery out, but we kind of expect to see in it's December. Are there any announcements before we begin this morning? Will you bow with me, please? Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this morning you've given us. We thank you for this time which we can study your word. Father, we have a number of family and friends who are struggling with illnesses, who are undergoing cancer treatments, who are undergoing surgeries. We ask you to be with each and every one of them. Father, we ask you to be with those of our membership here who've lost loved ones. We ask that you strengthen them and comfort them during this difficult time. In Jesus' name, amen. We got into verses 5 through 13 a little bit last week. This is the last verses of the book of Daniel, and the angel here is really wrapping up of what he's been talking about the past two chapters, about this vision that Daniel's having here. And as I reviewed for this week, and I thought, okay, it is a vision. Well, we've seen Daniel have dreams before. And these dreams are things that's going when he's sleeping, he's having these dreams. But this vision is something that is actually happening to him. He's alive. Well, of course he's alive, but he's awake, he's alert, and he knows what's going on. He sees this person. He hears this person. This person touched him, and he felt this person. So he's very aware what's going on because this is actually happening to him. It's not a dream that's going on. The things that have happened from chapter 10 on is a vision that he's seeing. And when this vision first started, we know that Daniel was with a couple other people that were with him. They were afraid. They ran off. So Daniel was left here alone. But this is not a dream. This is a vision. And I want to make sure that we understand it because Daniel has had some dreams. We've all had dreams. But it's something that was gone in our subconscious. But this is something that he is physically experiencing that we've been reading through chapters 10 through, we'll be reading through the end of chapter 12 as well. And when all this vision started, Daniel was with these folks on the besides the Tigris River. And in verse 5 we're picking up, Daniel is there. He's with this man that was in the linen that started this. This angel was there. And now they're joined by two others in verse 5. And I believe I read verses 5 through 13 last week. Did I? I don't know either. So I guess we'll read them again and we'll keep going. No. I did not. Okay. Every week up until now, when I was done, I drew a line and an arrow up saying end and a line down saying start. I didn't do that last week, so I had no clue where I was. And I wasn't going to go back to chapter 1 and start over. I knew I was in chapter 12. I'll read verses 5 through 13. The book of Daniel, chapter 12. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on the bank, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finished shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? He said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end of time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. From the time of that regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. We see that the angel is wrapping up everything that he's told Daniel in the previous two chapters. And he's not expanding anymore. He's not giving Daniel any more information of what's going on, no more detail. And as I first start off, that we're by the Tigris River. Daniel's there with this man in linen, which was explained back in chapter 10, and we see the same wordage going on here in chapter 12. They're joined by two others. We can assume that there's angels. They're not talked about anywhere else. There's no more description about these other twos that join them, other than the ones on this bank of the river and ones on the other. It doesn't say that they're angels, but because of what's going on, this vision that's happening, and we know there's one angel there, I'm assuming, and I believe I'm correct, that these other two are angels that are there with them. And we got to remember, when Daniel first had this vision, he was afraid of this man in linen. He gave a description how this was, and Daniel was afraid of him. He feared him, but now that his angel is talking, that fear is gone. He's no longer afraid. He hasn't been for a while. He's listening, trying to understand. He's getting the explanation of what's going to be happening. And the angel here, as we see, saying toward the end of the chapter, saying, I'm not going to tell you anymore. But if we go through verses 6 through 12, we can get a little bit more out of the information from this angel as he's wrapping up this whole vision, this whole story to Daniel. And like Daniel, he's asked many times as he's prayed to God, when will this end? And we know, what is he asking, what's going to end? The punishment of the Jewish people, because they've been in captivity for a long time. They've been in captivity through Daniel's life, long time being roughly 80, probably 75 years at this point, 75, 85, 70 years, because Daniel lived to be approximately 85. And at this point in chapter 12, Daniel is nearing the end of his life. So the Jewish people have been in captivity all that time, but this vision explained that they're going to be in captivity much longer. And Daniel's saying, when is this going to end? What is this outcome going to be? And one of these people that is on the banks of the river asked the same question in verse 6. When it said, when one of these men said to the guy dressed in linen, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? And I want to talk about some of the wordage here that's used, like the word wonder. The Hebrew word is, I believe it's pronounced Pele. And when we hear the word wonder, a lot of times we think of something that's awesome, something that's astounding and astonishing when you hear the word wonder. But in this case, it's not talking about that. The Hebrew word is actually interpreted as something as an extraordinary event. And that's what the Jewish people are going through. They're going through an extraordinary event, and it's not a good event. It's a special event. It's extraordinary because nothing like this has happened before. And this word, Pele, is the Hebrew word that's a noun. But earlier in chapter 8, the verb of that same word is used to describe a similar situation. It's pala, and that's it was used in chapter 8 talking about the ram and the goat. And this word means destructive deeds, which is similar to the word here, destroy, in chapter 8. So this wonders that we're talking about in chapter 12 here is an extraordinary event, and it's talking about the same situation in chapter 8 and chapter 12 here, the events of what's happening, the extraordinary events that's happening to the Jewish people, their punishment. And it's destructive deeds that are happening, which is what? The things that Antiochus IV is doing to the Jewish people. So these extraordinary events, these destructive deeds are happening to the Jewish people, and that's what's being talked about here in Daniel chapter 12 when the person asks, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? And these wonders are the deeds that Antiochus is doing to the Jewish people. And the last one here, when I referred to Daniel 8:24, it was saying his power will be mighty, but not by his own power. And this is all talking about Antiochus IV. He will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will, and he will destroy mighty men in the holy place. History tells us everything that Antiochus did. And what's being talked about here in chapter 8 is the same thing we just read here in chapter 12 in verse 6, referring to the words of until the end of these wonders. So the angel, the one angel that's on the bank asked, how long is it going to be until all these disastrous deeds that Antiochus has happened? When is this going to end? But he's not using those words. He's using it in the cryptic words, so to speak here, when how long will it be until the end of these wonders? He's asking the same question that Daniel has asked before. When is this going to end? And hopefully Daniel's going to get an answer to these questions, and so will this man. And the angel, when we go into verse 7, the angel's going to speak up again, that's above the river, the one dressed in the linen. He's going to talk to Daniel again and to these two men. Why these two there, I don't know. Did they really need to be there to ask this question? Daniel's asked it several times. Or are there as witnesses to what this angel that's above the river, the one dressed in linen, the one that's been speaking to Daniel all along, are they there as witnesses to hear and to kind of help confirm or assure Daniel of the words that this man dressed in linen is going to be speaking? But before this angel speaks, what does he do in verse 7? It doesn't say he raises his hand. It specifically says he raised his right hand and his left hand. So he's raising both of his hands, like he's going to give an oath, he's going to give a testament. I don't know if anybody here has been to court. I haven't been to court on either side of the bench, for the good or the bad. But you see it on TV here. When they take an oath to give a testimony, what do? You raise your right hand. It's interesting. You raise your right hand, not your left hand. Why? Don't know. Are they against left-handed people? Could be. But you raise your right hand. And it's to say, and what do they say? I solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth. Why does it matter that your hand's up? Is it symbolic? I don't know. Tom's saying yes. Oh, okay. Exactly. Bill.
The majority of people at that time were right-handed. When you came to talk to the person or the enemy, you raised your right hand, which means you didn't have a weapon.
Friendly?
So you raised your right hand to say, I'm at peace. That's what I heard.
That could very well be. And so far, everybody that's raised their hand about a question, raise your right hand, by the way. Tom, Bill, and Jason. Oh.
So
you never use left hand?
anything, you don't shake your hand, you don't eat food, you don't do anything with your left hand in Indian culture.
I mean,
Because it's offensive to everybody.
that makes sense. And remember, we're not talking about today's culture. We're talking culture.
This is the culture of India.
It's still today, yeah. But we're going back, what's way back 2,400 years ago. I mean, so, but this angel did raise his right hand and then his left hand. And it's like he's saying, what I'm about to say is the truth. And it makes note here in chapter 7 that he raised his right hand and his left hand. Didn't just raise, but he raised them toward heaven. This angel, the one dressed in linen that we're talking about this time, that's been speaking to Daniel, was sent from who? Was sent from God. And all the words that he's saying came from God. And now he's raising both hands as he's getting ready to explain more to Daniel that he's raised his hands, he's raised them toward heaven, and it says he swore by him, he's swearing by God who lives forever, and then he's going to give his answer. So he's telling Daniel, everything I'm about to tell you is coming from God, it's the truth. Bob. It's quite a common thing. And you're saying, the right hand.
Another thought, where do you want to sit on Judgment Day?
On the right hand. I mean, when we're wandering a little bit, when you hear things about to the right or to the left, typically, the Bible or in the world today, the right hand is usually good, the left hand is usually not. But when we think in the Bible, and that's a great example, where's Jesus sitting? On the right hand. Where do we want to be? On the right hand. And when oaths are taken, typically, you raise your right hand first. But this angel is vowing both hands up to heaven, and it specifically says, swore by him, he's raised his hands up toward heaven, he's swearing by, this is what God is telling me, and I'm relaying the message on to you. And it's saying, he's swearing the truth, he's appealing to God who lives forever. This is coming from the Heavenly Father, and the words I'm about to tell you is coming from God who lives forever. And it was common for people to say that phrase, who lives forever, throughout the Old Testament. We see it in Judges chapter 8. I didn't put any of these up on the screen. We see it in Judges 8:19. We see it in Ruth 3. We see it a couple times in 1 Samuel 14. The same phrase of who lives forever, referring to God, and that he's an everlasting being, that he is the one that is being talked about. And that's the same thing that this angel is saying. And when as he raised and swore by him who lives forever, all in reference to God. So the angel's saying, he raised his hand and he's getting ready to give an answer. And the first part of the answer to the question of how long in verse 6 was a time, times, and half a time. And I really didn't want to get too much into this when we hear those words. Ted, if you were here for that, Ted did a great class on the verbs of the 70 weeks, time, times, and half time, then the 1,290 days and the 1,335 days. A great class on that. I wish he was here to go into this, but he left it up to me. I struggled with this. Is this meaning a specific number of days? Am I to look at this literally? Are we as God's people to look at this amount of time as literally or a figurative type of time frame? Looking back through chapters 10 through 12, the first part of 12, I'm looking at more at a literal time frame if we look at this. Yes, Bob? It does. In Revelation 11, 12, and 14, it's all in there. It's also used back in Daniel 7. The same phrase of time, times, and half a time. Same wording. So yes, it is there, I think 7 times in the Old and New Testament combined. If we look at this literally in a time frame, times I've studied the word time referring to a period of time is 1 year. So if we look at this phrase, a time, times, and a half time, a time would be 1 year. Times would be 2 years. So that adds up to 3. Then a half a time would be a half a year, which would be 3.5 years. So if we look at this as a literal time frame, a time, times, and half time would be 3.5 years. Approximate. Daniel 7:25 uses the same wordage as he's talking about the persecutors of God's people by the little horn, which is Antiochus IV. 3.5 is an incomplete number, and it is half of a complete number, 7. And we know the relevance we see of 7 in the Bible. And 3.5 is also a number used other times in the Bible for a period of trial and tribulation. What are the Jewish people going to be going through under Antiochus? A period of trial and tribulation. And why are they going through this? They sinned against God and God's punishing them. But if we look at from when the Jewish people were in captivity, roughly back in 605 BC, to where Daniel is now, which is roughly 70 years, but none of that has to do with Antiochus. That's hundreds of years down the road. And Antiochus was in power for more than 3.5 years. But historical records, nothing in the Bible, but historical records that we have today show that Antiochus actively persecuted the Jewish people for roughly 3.5 years. There was many times when he was battling other people. He had traveled through Jerusalem and Palestine area that he had whacked the Jewish people around a little bit. He'd raid the temple. He'd take some of their money. But he wasn't actively punishing and persecuting the Jewish people. He did that for a period of about 3.5 years, approximately between 168 to 165 BC, where that was what he was focused on, is persecuting the Jewish people. And that would be a 3.5 year time period. So if I look at this and we look at this as a literal time frame of the phrase time, times, and half time, it works with what Antiochus did to the Jewish people, that time frame where he really persecuted them. So do we want to look at it like that? I'm leaning that way of that's what time, and halftime is. I don't think it's referring to anything down the future. I don't think it's referring to the second coming or a date that's way down the road, because everything that we're talked about in chapters 10 through 12 is talking about the persecution of the Jewish people, and that persecution is going to end. And that reign of terror from Antiochus is going to end, and we know it did end roughly 3.5 years when he started going after the Jewish people. So I believe the phrase here that the angel is using, a time, times, and halftime, is referring to a 3.5-year time period, which is when Antiochus first started specifically going after the Jewish people until that persecution was over. If anybody thinks something different, I'd like to hear that, because it's just a studying I did, and it's my best guess. So, any comment from you? I look to you quite often.
I agree completely with you. You haven't mentioned, and this is the trivial thing that Ed July do, that 3.5 years is also, I think, 1,290 days.
I was going to get to that, and when we get to verse
Go
12.
ahead with it.
No, you're right, it is. I mean, now the rest of the story. 3.5 years is 1,290 days, which we'll see later on in there, which is, if you want to continue on with that, but it is still the 1,290.
See, we have a calendar that has 28 days or 30 days or 31. But the calendar they used then was not a good calendar because it was a smack 30 days on a month. And so if you take 3.5 years, you come out to 1,290 days. And there's also something about weeks in there, isn't there?
Not in here.
It's not Daniel?
Not in chapter 12.
Well, anyway,
I don't
there's a
believe.
third way of counting days. It's the same length of time.
I believe it's chapter 7 when it's talking about 70 weeks.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the same length of time.
Yes. Yes. But that's not here in chapter 12. I believe it's chapter 7. It may be chapter 8, but it's talking about the 70 weeks. Yes.
Can I make one more comment?
Sure.
We're in verse 11, I guess. You aren't really there, but that's what we're talking about.
Well, I'm kind of at verse 7 and 8, but yeah. Well, the 1290 is in verse 11.
If we see these words, abomination and desolation, which is in verse 11, and we find it earlier in Daniel,
Yes.
every time it's earlier in Daniel, it's talking about
About.
Antiochus.
Exactly.
And I'm a textual kind of guy. I'm going to make my judgment about what things are talking about, how the text defines it.
Yes.
When it defines this as connected to the abomination of desolation, that means it's not talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years down the line. It's talking about back then, right then, not the day of Daniel, but the day Daniel was prophesying about.
Right. The,
Continuing with Antiochus before.
continuing on with the vision at this point in chapter 11 and 12, and also more explanation between the ram and the goat, the vision that happened back earlier with Daniel as well. I mean, all these stories, all these visions and dreams in Daniel are tying together. I mean, the one with Nebuchadnezzar with the statue, in there was the Medes and Persians and the Greeks. And then the one that Daniel had with the 4 beasts, the Greeks were in there. And then it come down to the ram and the goat, which is specifically getting down into Antiochus. So it seems like all these visions that are funneling down to what's happening, and it's all funneling down to chapters 10 and through 12 here, about what is going to happen to the Jewish people through or by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And to me, that is what the gist of the last 3 chapters of Daniel is about, is the punishment, the torment that Antiochus IV is going to put onto God's people in these verses. And this is the end of the story that we're hearing, but that is what it's all talking about. And as Terry said, the abomination, desolation, that's used earlier, referring to what Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be doing to the Jewish people. And here it comes up again later on in verse 11 here. And to me, that's, if we look at Daniel and we keep in mindset of what the whole story, this whole vision's about, it's hard to wander and say, well, no, this has to be referring to the Roman Empire. No, this has to be referring to the second of Christ. You can get to that point if you try hard enough by manipulating passages to get to say what you want. But if we look at the story as it is and look at history as it ties this story together, we know it's talking about Antiochus, the fourth Epiphanes, and what's going to happen to the Jewish people throughout all these visions, and especially here in chapter 12. And any other comment on that? Because we're going to be wrapping up verse 8 here. Or verse 7, I'm sorry. And it ends with the sharing of the power of the holy people. And I believe this is referring to the desecration of the temple by Antiochus IV. I mean, because what did the Jewish people hold on to? Their sacrifices that they always did in the temple. And we know what Antiochus did. It was brought up a couple times, and I've said it, how he built an altar to Zeus in there, and he offered swine in the temple. What that had to do to the Jewish people. And this is still the ending of the story of what Antiochus did. So not only did he kill people, but he was trying to get rid of their faith, and one of the things was desecrating the temple as he did. Daniel's hearing this. These other two people that are on the different banks of the river are hearing this from what this angel in linen is saying. And so some of the stories out there, how much these angels knew and why they were there, no idea. But it's in this vision for a reason. God had them in this vision for a reason. More so, I believe, for Daniel than for our benefit. In verse 8, Daniel's saying, "As for me, I heard, but I could not understand. So I said, my Lord, what will be the outcome of these events?" Daniel's been through a lot, and I can understand why he couldn't understand some or all or any of this. Remember, it started off, he was fasted for 21 days. So he's probably hungry. He's probably not thinking right because of what he's gone through. Now he's heard a lot of information. Some of it he can't understand because how can he understand this? What he's being told. Names aren't being told to him. Kings of the north, king of the south. Oh, what are you talking about? And nothing like that's going on now. He's being told stuff that's going to happen several hundred years removed from him. That's what he's being told. This is going to happen down the road. But he's not told that this is, Daniel, 384 years from now, this is going to happen. He's not being told that. These events are going to happen. And Daniel, if he's trying to digest this, well, there's nothing in power like that could happen now. Because in the time frame that Daniel's living, at that time he's seeing the vision, the Medo-Persian Empire had just conquered Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar's out, the Medes and Persians are in, so he's no longer under, the Jewish people are no longer under captivity of the Babylonians, or under the captivity of the Medes and Persians. That is his real life right then and there. And what's being talked about is the Greeks and Romans, their empires are not even on the horizon yet. That's 300-400 years down the road. And these things are what Daniel's being told is going to be happening. So it is difficult for him to understand. I mean, we got history to understand what Alexander the Great did, and then his kingdom was divided up into 4 nations. And then we can also understand the conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. All of this is new to Daniel. There's nothing at his time frame that shows these things. Then how can one ruler from the Seleucid Empire be so wicked that he's going to be the one that is going to punish and torment God's people? That's what Daniel's being told. And all of this is going to be happening down the road. So I can understand how it is so hard for him to understand and grasp everything that he's been told. And I believe I said it last week. I don't know how long this vision took, whether it took a few minutes, an hour, a couple hours, or a day. I don't know. But a lot of information is being told to Daniel, and it's stuff that is being foretold of what's going to happen in the future. So I can understand Daniel saying, I heard these things, but I couldn't understand it. And then what does he do? He says, my Lord, what's going to be the outcome? I heard what you said. I don't understand it. But what's going to be the end result? That's what Daniel's looking for now. What's going to be the end result? And I'm sure he is looking for an answer. Well, Daniel, the end result is going to be God's people are going to be set free, and there's going to be no more punishment. But the angel looks at him and says, in verse 9, he said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end of time. I'm not telling you anymore. I've told you everything I'm going to tell you. These words are going to be sealed up and until the end of time. And the end of time is not the second coming, in my opinion. I believe the end of time is the fulfillment of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. And that is the punishment, the end of the punishment of the Jews by God through Antiochus IV. I believe that that's what the angel is saying. that these words are going to be sealed up, they're going to be kept hidden, they're going to be kept secret until the punishment of God's people is done, which is going to be at the end of the time of Antiochus. That's what I believe is being told here in verse 9. And that's what Daniel's saying. The angel's saying, go your way, Daniel. Everything I told you is going to be kept a secret until the end of time. And the end of time referring to, when we can look back at history, is the punishment of the Jewish people. And verse 10 goes on a little bit to what was told earlier, I believe in chapter 11, that many would be purged, purified, and refined. It's talking about the Jewish people, how they're, as you go through trials and tribulations, it makes you stronger. If it don't break you, it makes you stronger. And that's what's happening to the Jewish people as they're being punished. Why are they being punished? Because they did something wrong. When you do something wrong, you get punished. It's hopefully to make you better. I know that's what my parents tried to do to me when I did something wrong. I didn't go sit in a corner. They either patted me, told me what I did was wrong, and they tried to make it so I wouldn't do that again. God's punishing his people because they sinned against him, and he's trying to make them a better people. He's trying to purge the bad out of them, purge the bad people. He's trying to refine them to get them better. And that is what this punishment is that there's going through. And it's the same language here in verse 10 of chapter 12 that's being used in chapter 11, verse 35. And this punishment and this purging, this purifying, this refinement is being done by God, but God's doing it through Antiochus IV. So this time frame that Antiochus is reigning over the Jewish people and causing trouble for them and terrorizing them, you know, God's allowing it. God is punishing his people, and I believe Jason said it several weeks ago, that this time, God's not with them. He's punishing them. So they're there without God. Are they protected? Yeah. There's angels protecting them to make sure that they're spiritually protected. But some of them are still falling away. But they are there without God. They're being punished. This whole time, from 605 to 400 plus years later, 480 years roughly, the Jewish people are being punished because of their sins. And Deanna's wanting to know, when is this going to end? And we know when the ending was, at the end of Antiochus. But the Jewish people are going to be punished again later on. Other things are going to happen to the Jewish people. But this punishment is going to come to an end. They're going to be the Jewish people that get through this, that stay faithful and truthful to God, that continue to follow what he says. Those that are purged, refined, and purified, those are going to come out stronger on the other side of this. Daniel stayed faithful to God. Daniel's not going to see the end of this purging and refinement. He's not going to see the end of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. Daniel's going to pass away a few years after this conversation he's having with this angel. This punishment is going to end 300 plus years down the road. I don't know the right words to say this, so if I say something that doesn't seem right, please let me know. But this punishment that they're going through is strictly not a physical punishment. Yes, the Jews were killed, they were tortured, their faith was shaken because of what happened to the temple. But I believe there's also a punishment going on because during the time frame between the Old and New Testament, the Maccabees were there, and they stayed faithful to God. And the people, even before the Maccabees, while the Jewish people were going through this, stayed faithful to God, they were still teaching and preaching to the Jewish people to stay strong, to stay faithful. So if you're one of the Jewish people that was starting to lean toward the Jewish to the Greek culture, to starting to slip, to starting to fall away from God, when you have somebody that has insight and knowledge and power that is trying to talk to you and convince you, say, no, stay faithful to God. He's the one that's going to bring you through this. That is also a refinement, that is a cleansing that's going to kind of punish you. If you know you did something wrong, you feel this guilt. And I'm sure that's part of the punishment that some of these Jews were going through as well, because they're having some of this guilt that they did fall away from God, but now they're starting to turn back, if that makes sense. I didn't know the right way to say that. I couldn't even write it down, because it's more than just a physical punishment that the Jewish people are going through. Because we can be punished physically, and that won't change us. It's got to be the change of the heart on the inside. And that's what the Jewish people needed to be able to get refined and purified is the way God wants them to be. And verse 10, it ends with, the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. Some of the same words are used in Revelation 22. Let the ones who do wrong still do wrong. Let the one who is filthy still be filthy, and let the one who is righteous still practice righteousness. And the one who is holy still keep himself holy. There were Jewish people back in that time that remained faithful to God, stayed strong, and encouraged others to be faithful to God. There were Jewish people back in that day who were not faithful to God, remained not faithful to God, and lived the rest of their life that way. Some of those fell into the Hellenistic view of the Greeks, which is following their culture. And I believe what's happening here in verse 10 is very similar to the wordage here in Revelation. Some people aren't going to change. They're just not going to change no matter what they see. And I believe that's where it's talking about the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. These Jewish people that fell away, they're not going to change their way. They don't see what they're doing is wrong. They're going to remain following the Greek culture and the Hellenistic views of what's going on during that time frame. And I believe that's what verse 10 is talking about, that some people aren't going to change. They're going to stay bad, and those that stayed faithful, they're going to remain faithful, and they're not going to fall away no matter what happens. And history shows that many of the Jews did stay faithful throughout this time period and these trials that went on through Antiochus. Now the tough verses 11 through 13. From the time of the regular sacrifice is abolished. I believe that's referring to the sacrifices that were going on in the temple back in the day. And the abomination of desolation is set up. Terry touched on briefly of the abomination of what's happened to the temple. There will be 1,290 days. This is where it was mentioned that 1,290 days is 3.5 years, which earlier in the chapter here, the time frame, which is where Antiochus IV Epiphanes really started persecuting the Jews, those 3.5 years. And I believe that's what this is referring to. It's a reference, this 1,290 days in verse 11 is referring back to the times, and halftime. That's when this persecution is going to end. And in the verse 12, it talks about how blessed is he who keeps waiting. So after these 1,290 days, after this persecution is over, those are blessed who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. That's 45 days more than the 1,290. And I believe this is tied to the abolishment of the regular sacrifice and the abomination of desolation as told here. And I believe it was 45 days after all that the sacrifices for the Jewish people was reinstated. So those that went through all this trials and tribulation of Antiochus IV for that 3.5 year period, those 1,290 days, 45 days after that was over, the sacrifices were reinstated, which would give us that 1,335 days. That's what I believe verses 11 and 12 are referring to here. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Makes sense. I mean, you can make the Bible say a lot of things if you work hard enough. If you go, I'm just going to pick these phrases out. But with what I've studied, and if I keep in mind the context of what's happening through not just chapters 10, 11, and 12, but the entire book of Daniel, what it was referring to. And to me, the theme is the punishment of the Jews through Antiochus. When it keeps getting filtered down, and history has shown us, well, Antiochus really did punish them for roughly this time frame. Well, after this was over, it was roughly 45 days later, and the sacrifices were reinstated. We can look at this through hindsight and say, these numbers add up. This matches what history tells us, versus Daniel looking down the road. 1,290 days from when? 1,335 days from what? What are you talking about? So I believe that what this is referring to is from when Antiochus had his 3.5-year terror on the Jewish people. Then the 1335 is 5 days after that the sacrifices were reinstated at the temple. Verse 13, and we can, Bob, I'm sorry.
I have a thought. They're talking about kind of like end of time. Could this be the end of time of the old law when they destroyed the temple? We got a new system today compared to the old. Would that come in that picture?
This would be the destruction of the temple under Antiochus, not in roughly 70 AD by the Romans. That is what this is referring to. Okay, so this is before what we hear about the temple being destroyed in the New Testament, which is by the Romans in 70 AD. This is before that. I want to say Antiochus did this roughly 165, somewhere between 165 and 168 BC is when that happened. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but I don't believe it's referring to the destruction in the New Testament by the Romans. Verse 13, again, the angel's talking to Daniel. But as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Just as in verse 9, Daniel was told to go on your way. No more information's coming. I'm not going to give you any further explanation. I'm done talking about this. And at this point, it's roughly 536 BC, toward the end of Daniel's life. He's an older man. He's in his mid-80s. And the angel's saying, you will enter into rest. And I believe rest here is referring to Daniel's death and him lying in his grave. That Daniel, enjoy the rest of your life. You're going to enter into rest, but you're going to rise again. And I believe, all along I'm saying, none of this is referring down the road to the second coming. But looking at this, with what happened in the very last part of 13, saying, enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. I believe the rise again is referring to the bodily resurrection of Daniel. And in the allotted portion, the Hebrew word is gorel, I believe that's how I pronounce it. And in the Old Testament, it's referred to as various tribal territories given to the Israelite in the promised land. That is when they use the word allotted portion, giving portions of land of the promised land to the Jewish people. And here I believe it's talking about, Daniel, when you die, you're going to rise again, and you're going to get your allotted portion, not in the promised land, but in the heavenly kingdom with God for eternity. That's what I believe verse 13 is wrapping up with. As all these things were explained to Daniel, but at the very end, Daniel, you yourself, you are going to rise again. Your body is going to rise, and you're going to get your portion of what you've earned. You're going to get your portion of what you worked for, and that portion is in the heavenly kingdom. That's what I believe verse 13 is talking about. I don't believe it's anything physical on this earth, there's anything that's going to be happening to him. I believe it was the spiritual things that Daniel's going to get at the end of time for him. That's it. Any comments? You got 2 minutes. Kind of time that right. Any questions on this? Anything you want me to go back over? Anything you want me to recap? Does verse 13 make sense? Is it like, Cliff, why all of a sudden you're talking about the end of time for Daniel? Well, that's what I think it means from everything I've read and studied. It makes sense of everything that the angel had described to Daniel. Terry.
I'd like to throw one idea here at the end about, you mentioned that there are wordings here, numbers of times in Daniel that are also similar or exact wording in the book of Revelation.
Absolutely.
Or even in the New Testament and the Gospel. Why? There were two different destructions of the temple. One was Antiochus and one was in AD 70. And here in Daniel, we've come to the conclusion from your study that this is all talking about the time of Antiochus.
Yes.
But there was another destruction of the temple in AD 70 that he's not talking about here, but when they talked about it in the New Testament, they were
Fair enough. And to dovetail on what you're saying about what's in the New Testament about the destruction of the temple, remember, AD 70 was after Jesus has died. So really, you think about it, Jesus was the sacrifice here. Why would the Jewish people have to have any other physical sacrifice after that? So the Romans, by taking all that out, the Jewish people are no longer making physical sacrifice because Jesus had already come and already died. He was the sacrifice for their sins at that point. So, I mean, is it a coincidence all that happened? Don't think so. Is it a coincidence some of these words are the same from in Revelation to the other places in the New Testament, the Old Testament? No. Jesus himself, I can't remember what chapter in Matthew, refers to some of the things in Daniel about, the abomination and desolation. And so Jesus is referring back to this. That was bad back then. That's nothing going to be compared to what's going to happen now. So, and there's other phrases throughout. I showed many times in Daniel that this is the same thing that's in Jeremiah, same thing in Matthew, same thing in Revelation. And many times through chapter 12, it referred to a lot. You can see some of the same words used in Revelation quite often. But I don't think you need to take them the same way because Revelation is not talking about the things that were being said here in Daniel. Because Daniel is talking about really Antiochus IV and the things that the Jewish people went through during that time frame. And there's no record of all that in the Bible itself. It's all what you hear us say between the Testaments. I've said that several times. There's that 400-year period that there's no record of what happened to the Jewish people in the Bible. It's all historical records that we have of what the Jewish people went through, which is the fulfillment of this vision that Daniel had here. So the only proof that we have of that is the historical records that are still around today of what the people went through, what those nations went through back in, between 0 AD or 0 BC to 165 to, 536 toward Daniel's time. So there's 400 years there. There's no history of it in the Bible. It's all historical records that we have through the nations that kept those things. Any comments? I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the questions and comments through all of this. I hope I didn't bore you with some of this. If you have any questions or anything, if you saw any slides from a while back, I still got those. If you want anything, I got it. But I really appreciate this. I learned so much from this. Ted July said, you know it's a good class if the teacher learns more than the students. I learned way more than I anticipated here. I was looking to talk about the fiery furnace and the lion's den. Those are just little blips on the screen to everything that was here. I didn't expect to get into this much detail. And I really appreciate you being here and all the questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Hey, Cliff, thanks for all the time you put into it. You did a great job.
Thank you. I'm glad to. I learned so much.